Good afternoon, and welcome to the first concurrent session of the day, Eliminating Barriers, Embracing Student Complexity. Our presenters today are Kay Walter and Kathryn Broyles, faculty members at University of Arkansas at Monticello and the American Public University System. If you have any questions for the presenters during the session, please feel free to enter those into the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room, and we'll address them at the end of the talk. On that note, I will hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Dr. Walter and I have been collaborating for a few years now, and we've been focusing particularly on the thriving of first-generation college students and veterans in the academy, and we are committed to eliminating barriers and embracing student complexity. So today we've joined forces to share a lesson from start to finish that moves outside of the traditional classroom and into the community in order to empower both, and to follow that up with some philosophical consideration of how innovative educators such as yourselves can do the same kind of thing online, move beyond the classroom, but with the awareness of how critical considerations of the architecture of the learning management system can impact that move. Dr. Walter?
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Kathryn, for the introduction. My part of this presentation is about a practical approach to eliminating barriers and embracing student complexity. And so it's about how I use assignments to do that work. And so I'll tell you, first of all, I'm a British literature generalist at my university. And curiously enough, my university is also my alma mater, and that plays in very carefully to the sort of assignments I give. So I teach a lot of Shakespeare and Romanticism, but I also teach things like drama and film. We're a small university. I've taught American Lit, Bible is Lit, but most importantly, I think, is my work with freshman composition. I volunteered to teach freshman composition every semester because I want to stay connected with my students. In particular, I teach that freshman composition. My students are like family to me because my whole family attended this university. I'm a graduate and alumna of this university, so I have both a professional but also a personal attachment with my students. And that matters in my pedagogical approach. So I'll tell you a little about my freshman composers. My students come with many challenges. In Arkansas, we're a rural school in Southeast Arkansas, and they're products mostly of our local public school systems, and those don't work very well. They face teacher shortages constantly, they're underfunded, they tend to produce weak graduates, so students come to us with a wide variety of needs. Locally, our poverty rates are very high. There are two public school systems in our area. One of them is 100% funded for student meals. Most of our graduates, between 50 and 75% of the graduates of our university are first-generation scholars. And I'm an alumna, as I said, so I have this personal connection. Someone in nearly every family of students that I teach has a lifestyle that's based on a government sort of dole. They aspire to live on the check. And I fight that constantly because the biggest poverty I see in my students is a poverty of aspiration. And so I'm constantly trying to find ways to not only instruct my students and prepare them for successful futures, but to use them to help instruct the community. Education in my area is seen as both dangerous and risky, as well as a sort of a hope for the future. So we work on that with the assignment I'm going to talk to you about today. My students come to me knowing some things very well, and some of these things are obstacles to their learning. And I won't try to go through all of these with you, but there are things I wish they'd never learned. And one of the most important is for 13 years, they've been taught to read as fast as they can, to like read more, read faster, hurry up. my students spend a lot of time learning to slow down and to read less, far more carefully than they ever have. We talk about how real reading changes your behavior. When you read something important, it should change you in some way. It should change your opinion or change what you do next. It changes your experience. And they don't really know that. They've been taught to keep quiet. And I encourage my students to actively engage in their own education, not just in my own classroom, but in all their classrooms. And so I wish they'd never been taught to stay quiet, color in the lines. We live in a world, I think, with too many lines. And so I'm trying to teach my students to problem solve, to think critically, to reach outside those lines. The last couple, maybe I should mention, educational credentials are a matter of course. Like if they just sit in the seat for 4 years, they'll graduate without realizing that the purpose of an education is to become educated. And so I'm trying to teach my students to reach beyond my classroom to bigger success. And of course, this idea that education can be very dangerous. We have to work on that. There we go. They come with the hopes and expectations, but also the suspicions of their own support network. My students all have a support network. They don't come to college by accident. Everyone wants their children to get an education because they see that as a means of overcoming the poverty of their past. They still, in Arkansas, I have families who save for generations to send one bright hope to college, even though they're very suspicious of the results. They're afraid, families are afraid that they might lose their child physically. They may get an education and move away to Chicago or New York and do something else with their lives. They don't want to lose them spiritually. I live in the Bible Belt, and parents are very territorial about their children's beliefs. And of course, they don't want to lose them intellectually. They don't want the students to learn too much and forget their family wisdom. I live in rural Arkansas. My school is known for its forestry program, is one of the best in the nation. We have a jazz studies program. English we're working on, but they see education as both a tool, but also a danger. And that's the sort of ideas that I'm fighting. And so my response is to design projects that will help my students overcome the background that they bring. And one thing that I noticed this morning in the Hawks presentation was the idea that Certify is meant to be a lower stakes learning environment. And I see that sort of as the purpose of my service learning project. I make my students do a service learning project because I realize that high stakes testing and high stakes learning and high stakes environment don't always give me the best response of what my students have mastered, they're mastering. So I've developed a service learning project. And in this service learning project, I ask my students to recognize and identify their own support networks. Who helped them get to college? Who's invested in their success? I expect their projects to demonstrate both service and learning components for my students. They can't just serve their communities. They have to be able to articulate that they've learned something. And in response to my project, I hope they become accountable for demonstrating the relevance of what they're learning and its importance. How I always tell my students, if what I teach you is only applicable inside the walls of my classroom, there's a big world out there. We're really wasting our time. You need to learn something that can apply to your life. So these projects, I hope, will inspire curiosity about university studies in the juniors and their support networks, and also maybe in lifelong learning in their elders. My assignment sheets, I give an assignment sheet for every assignment, and they're all very information dense. By the time we get to the service learning project, my students are accustomed to reading those, and I'm going to share pieces of this assignment sheet with you today. They provide background, guided pre-writing, they identify the purpose, they give them the formatting rules. There's one part of my assignment sheet that's inside a box, and inside the box in boldface is the actual prompt they write to. I'll show you that when we get there. But before I share this information with you, I want to say that I would love and welcome feedback on this assignment. I'd like to improve it. I'd like to continue the inspiration, the effectiveness of this in my classroom. So if anybody wants to talk about it, please, I encourage you to do that. Okay, so the first part of my assignment sheet is where I provide background information. And I tell my students, this is the part I call read this, right? So they read this and we all assume that this information is just true, that we can agree with this. The idea that Southeast Arkansas is an area known for being suspicious of education. So we hear people who complain about dumb PhDs, you know, people who have an education but lack real world knowledge and no common sense. People without educational credentials feeling conflict with us. And those who pursue university degrees, like my students, have to combat elitism and use our education to better our communities and help bridge the gap. And elitism is a word that my students and I have to really discuss, and we talk about. They know what elite means, but they have no idea what elitism is. And we have to learn to not hold ourselves above those who can't aspire to an education, but to use our education in service to our communities. The next part of my assignment sheet is pre-writing questions. This is the part I call think about this. So I tell my students, before you've done some pre-writing, before you've asked yourself and tried to answer really hard questions, you're not ready to write a draft. So I present them always with a series of questions, multiple questions. I think there are 8 here, and I won't read them all to you. You can read them for yourself, but I ask them to think about, who is it that's sacrificing to enable your presence at college? Someone is. Someone is sacrificing money or something is invested in their success and is the great hope. It presents the student as a great hope for their future. So then I ask them to think about, what investments do people make other than money? Is there anything we can learn to value? And I hope my students come to see time and compassion and the mercy that people have on little children as part of the investment. They raise them up. And I'm big on gratitude in my classes. I'm trying to teach my students to feel gratitude, but not just feel it, to demonstrate it. And so further down, it says, why is it important not just to be grateful, but to demonstrate our gratitude? And I want my students to begin to wrestle with the idea, not only that it is important, but why is it important? And how that gratitude can encourage success and why we're responsible for sharing knowledge. And that's sort of what the service learning assignment is about. So the next part is the part in the box. So this is on the assignment sheet, this is inside a box, and you can see that part of it there is in bold print. So the assignment is for them to choose a group with no other access to the information they're studying in the course. And that precludes their using like their fraternity brothers on campus or anyone who could be in the class with them. And it requires them to go out into their community and connect with their 4-H club or their scout group or their city choir or something, and gather up a group. And during the pandemic, this was particularly hard because we had to stay in our own social bubble. But that gave my students a chance to gather up sort of their family. And I asked them to talk about what they've learned about education, John Ruskin, his students, lifelong learning, and mentors. And those are the themes of my composition classroom. We read about John Ruskin, we read about his interaction with his students, how he taught students outside of traditional classrooms, how he mentored students, and we talk about the mentors in their lives as well. And their assignment is to collaborate with their audience to write a thank you note to a teacher, a school, or a mentor. And I tell them your purpose is to explain the connection between the things they're learning and their group's experiences. So their group has been to school or hasn't been to school or wanted to go to school and get an education. And I ask them to make those connections. And I warn them to refrain from writing the note themselves. They can't just write a thank you note, and their audience can't just write it. This requires them to be leaders, to work in a team, and to respond in a collaborative response, which mentions John Ruskin and expresses gratitude politely. Maybe it's also a lesson in manners, which is a good thing, I think, at any time. So the formatting rules for my assignment say, your response will be delivered. I actually put these in the post and mail them to someone. Be sure to identify a mailing address before you begin. Write the final draft on an appropriate card, turn it in unsealed in an addressed envelope with appropriate postage attached. So it has to be unsealed, of course, because I have to be able to read it to give them a grade. So I need to know what they're saying. And they have to clear their audience and their plans with me before they begin. So those are the guidelines. And basically, all I'm asking them to do is write a thank you note, but that thank you note has implications. And so the goals of my assignment, first of all, I want much more than a note, of course, out of this. I want my students to focus on the process of composition rather than the product of composition. They will write plenty essays and research papers in my class, but this assignment asks them to think about pre-writing, to think about collaborating, to think about feedback, to think about sharing and working in groups. It replaces a high-stakes perspective in grading with something that encourages them at the level they feel more comfortable with their own support network. It spotlights them as educators. And so suddenly they're not just students anymore. They become the teacher. It's their job to share. And it spotlights education as something familiar and not suspicious and dangerous. So their support network begins to see education as something they can encourage and relate to in their family. It benefits their support group, of course. They learn something about John Ruskin and education and aspirations. And I think it encourages their family conversations relevant to my class material. It makes my class material relevant to their family conversations. Suddenly, every weekend when my students go home, grandma's saying, how's your English class going? And that's really important when they're trying to write their annotated bibliography and their research papers and their final exams. They have their support network directly involved when they go to the grocery store or when they go to get their hair cut. Somebody's saying, oh, great, your grandma told me about that English class you're studying. And I have family invested in their success. And it immerses my students in a community group of their own and strengthens the investment of their members in their education. And that's my assignment for service learning. And I would love to discuss the details of this with anyone who's interested. There's my contact information. You'll see that I'm a professor of English, that I also edit a newsletter. There's my URL, my email address. Please connect with me. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. I hope that it's broadcasting appropriately. So my part of this discussion is linked to the ideas that Kay has shared, but for myself, as you can see, I teach at American Military University. The broader institution is American Public University System. So I'm teaching full-time online. And what I want to explore a bit today is building community and centering and empowering students, not just in brick and mortar institutions, but among geographically dislocated students who are not unlike the students that Kay is working with and who may be engaging in either full-time online or in a program that's at a distance, maybe a hybrid course. So I'm asking about how can online choices made in terms of utilization of apps, software, multimodal function, how can we think about these in terms of the challenges that such students face. And I'm sure you all here, as well as myself, have experienced things a bit differently over the last 3 years. We've had 3 years of pandemic pedagogy, thanks to COVID, and likely you've had much more experience teaching online, if you weren't already in that space, than you ever anticipated before. And perhaps we're even challenged in ways that challenge your personal commitment to engagement, to the ways that you interact with your students. You maybe felt pressed and stretched beyond your capabilities online. And it may even be what brought you to this conference. You realize the potential of the environment, but you want to know more. So as someone who's been teaching full-time online for the last 14 years, and not talking to people a lot, I'm stumbling today. I've been teaching online a long time, and in the digital space 23 years. And I want to offer help to you, but I also want to offer a caution as you think about how to implement the digital tools that can help you help your students. So research by people like Self, Paloff, and Pratt, to name a few, are very clear that the digital space is not parallel to the face-to-face campus. Unfortunately, it's still quite possible for teachers to be dealing with administrators and programmatic expectations whose demands don't fully acknowledge the required shift in pedagogy that teachers are having to make when they move online. And often, and I know this has happened to a lot of you as well, you may have to be occupying a campus classroom and online classroom at the same time, and trying to be two very different educators in that space. And it's just not productive. The research is clear. You can't simply dump a traditional class into an online management system, a learning management system, or LMS for short, and expect faculty and students alike to thrive. Nor can faculty assume that their own role in both locations is the same. So what I wanted to do today is offer some questions to you. So what are some mental frameworks and some pedagogical strategies that might support online success for you and your students as you begin to implement all the wonderful ideas that you're meeting in this summit? What I want to do is ask you to think about how you fight the good fight for your students when shaping an online classroom experience that you may not have considered before, because I've come to realize that technology in the educational sector can be, but not always, about access. It can be about convenience, but sometimes it's not about either of those things or either innovation. So it is about innovation, yes, but it's also about surveillance. And that's probably not the word you're anticipating me to offer. And surveillance is an ominous word, and one that we need to spend just a little bit of time on as pedagogues if we're going to help our students succeed. So what I want to do is offer some framing questions for you as you're working on this mental framework that you need to build your next online experience for your students, or maybe a whole online class from the ground up. So here are my 2 questions for you, and I've kind of distilled them on the screen there, but I'm going to say a bit more around them. So the first question I'd like you to ask yourself is, how might the digital landscape, often enabling quite successfully access for working class adult learners, for military affiliated students like my own constituency, students still quarantined depending on where they live, also simultaneously be constructed architecturally to inhibit the academic freedom, access to social capital, and the personal success that it's actually meant to foster in the first place. Then we also want to take a look at how might pedagogy look that actively exercises awareness of commodification of online spaces and resist the shape of online architecture that centers data collection instead of centers students. And worse yet, this is really important, rich data sets. When it centers rich data sets and not individual student thriving and personal fulfillment as the true measure of an effective classroom. And no, we are not going to try and answer these two giant questions today, but I hope that in recognizing them, we're already on the path to leveraging classroom architecture of any kind in an innovative way that sees online classrooms succeed for students, and that they enjoy the personal and emotional success of a brick and mortar classroom and not just equitable outcomes, because research does show the learning that takes place is the same, but the experience, of course, is not. But what I'm concerned with is that we're missing actually helping the students we're providing the access to. So the online environment for learning in any discipline democratizes access for students, geography, ability, financial constraints and affordability. Often these stop being problems when students have access online. But if online learning is continued to be exciting, then educators have to resist, and I have us pushing the stone up the hill there, or at the very least operate with constant awareness of that commodification that I mentioned. Now, I said that an LMS is a learning management system. Many of you know that, but I wanted, if you're new to online learning, I want to bring to your awareness that you're probably engaging in LMS work without thinking about it. You maybe just think of it as online software that you can use to support your class if you want to, things like Blackboard or Sakai or D2L or Brightspace. In fact, these are all encompassing pedagogical landscapes and often spaces instructors actually only tangentially impact, which is quite a bit different than the physical spaces that you build each semester or that you inhabit with your students in a traditional setting. So functionally set up, the space of the LMS is predetermined in many ways. So it's vital that we render visible implicit assumptions in constructing that space, because sometimes they decenter human complexity. If an LMS is not immediately responsive and malleable for faculty and teachers using it, it doesn't just not free up the faculty to innovate, it can actually hamper successful teaching. Faculty have to recognize that the virtual classroom, both provided by and controlled by institutional and corporate power brokers, is what you're engaging with. And I know I sound maybe a little bit alarmist, and I don't mean to be, but we really need to think critically about this, because someone else has often, when you're part of an institution, made the decision for you about the LMS that you will occupy. And in doing so, they have moved you into an online structure that you have to inhabit with your students. And so how you move around in that space is going to impact a lot. And you might not recognize that that space is not only impacting a lot, it's changing how you do you. And I want you to be aware of that. And so you can be proactive in pushing against it where you need to, so that you can maintain your own commitment to yourself and your students and what you think is good teaching. So, got myself here. Yeah, sorry. So I know that you all here are innovative at every level and in every discipline. But I want you to think of, and what I have up here, I want you to think of data as thriving. Okay, let me back up here. When I was thinking about the LMS and saying how it impacts you, I simply want to emphasize that it's not a benign space, right? That it's active as you're active in it. I hope that makes sense. I think I've got myself straight here. So curriculum and pedagogy forced to fit into the functionality of the space and the LMS architecture, it can limit you and it can limit your students, and it can limit the way that you innovate. but it can also be parameters by which you innovate in new ways because you're aware of the barrier. Kind of in the way that you give parameters for your students in an assignment. And because of that, they bloom and ask questions in a particular way. So I want you to also envision that architecture that is restricting you, right? Because your institution said you have to have forums look this way, or you have to have announcements here. Use those restrictions as parameters that force you, as well as your students, to be creative in moving beyond the classroom. It's just vital. So up here, data versus thriving. This online architecture, I want you to think about this as visual space, because I think a lot of times the way that we become familiar with social media, we don't think of it as a building that we're occupying. We just think of it as a series of images, but I'm inviting you to think about your space in those physical terms, because it impacts how you teach even in the real world. And so if institutional policies, when you adopt technology on your campus, impinge on your praxis, it's important that you call it to the attention of administration. Or if you're lucky enough to be on a committee that's making choices about an LMS, that you think about how you would experience it and whether it would keep you from being faithful to the ways you teach. So let me give you a very simple, very practical example of what I mean. So you're already familiar with the way architecture impacts you in your physical classroom, right? And sometimes it's in funny ways. You might have this conversation in your head. For example, yay, I got the classroom with the view of the big tree, right? For that 8 o'clock class that's so hard, at least you can look out the window and see the beautiful day. Or maybe you're excited because you got the classroom with the big tables and you now have space to do some collaborative work that you had been hoping to try with a group. Or maybe you're just excited that you've got movable chairs this semester in your school. So the architecture available to you enables you to do things that you want to do as a pedagogue. So if you're in a classroom that does not have movable chairs and you want your students to experience collaboration, that architecture is stymieing your commitment to group work, right? You have to work around it. That is also true of the online architecture and the apps that you use and the way that you build within the LMS. And that's what I want you to recognize, because it can keep you from doing things that you've always been committed to as an instructor. So one way that this happens to me all the time is in my class. When I was trained, I did my first master's in English. My PhD is in Comp Red and language acquisition. And one of my key mentors was a woman who was absolutely fundamentally committed to the integrity of student voice. And I studied under her as a graduate teaching assistant, and we were forbade to write on student work. Now, that doesn't mean we didn't respond to student work, but we were forbade to write on student work because that was affecting a student's voice. It was altering their intentions. We instead could respond with letters. We could meet them out in conferences. We could provide rubrics, but we were not to write on that work. In my present circumstance, I have to write on student work. It's policy. So whether I'm committed to that kind of integrity of voice for my students, I am required to use track changes, to alter the structure and meaning of the sentences they've submitted to me, to respond to them in ways that can be digitally visual. And that document written upon is actually a requirement of the institution. So yes, I can make a video talking to them. Yes, I can meet them in a conference, but I am still forced to write across their voice. And I never get used to it. But in my institution, because of the structures of the LMS, that decision was made for me. That's a very small one, but big ones can be made as well. And so I just want you to be aware of this. Assessment, not just of students, but of faculty becomes subject to and shaped by what can be streamlined and counted. That's the other big thing that I want to throw in here. And then I will stop with the theory and the constructs and look forward to conversation with you. But one big thing that teachers and faculty tend not to think about, we get excited about innovation. We get excited about apps and ways to do new things digitally. And we forget that in the digital world, surveillance, remember I mentioned that before? Surveillance is built in to LMS systems. And sometimes they're chosen not so because they provide opportunities for innovation, although they usually do. But the primary concern of the administration was access to evaluation and surveillance of students and of faculty. And it's a very different experience to be surveilled in terms of your praxis when you don't know you're being surveilled. It's quite different to be always aware of a report versus knowing that someone may pop into your classroom this month, or that you may have a visit from a colleague who is curious about how your lecturing is going. And so that's another thing that you need to be aware of as a faculty member. So when you invite things into your classroom or you build within them, don't forget that piece of the puzzle. And when you're on a committee, advocate that the integrity and the thriving of your faculty and of your students must be paramount over big data. Now I have a lot more to say about big data, but I want to stop there and just thank you for being here as innovators and for working hard to hold space and eliminate barriers for your students, whoever they are, as you teach. And I'll go back and say that's who I am. And I am happy to communicate with anyone now in the Q&A or after this summit.
Thank you both so much for presenting today. We do have one question for Dr. Walter. How do you think the student's role as the educator rather than the learner in this assignment helps create a unique learning experience?
Well, I think my students, because they are educators in this assignment, I think it gives them an opportunity to feel empowered, to be the authority, where they've always seen themselves, my freshmen, they've always seen themselves as, you know, as children, as learners, and they're trying to stretch into adulthood and a successful career. And I think being able to go to the people who are their support network, who have gotten them in this position to learn, and show them, here's what I've mastered. I am learning something important. I think it gives them real confidence to take in, not just into my other assignments, but in every class and into their careers.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And we do have a question for Dr. Broyles as well. What is one limitation of online learning programs or forums that you've noticed since the pandemic began? And how do you overcome that in your classroom?
That's a great question. There's many answers to that. I think one thing that it's important to be aware of is the angst that students bring to any classroom about writing and about grammar, they bring to online forums. A lot of people who don't teach all the time online don't realize how text heavy the online world is, and in terms of education. And so my students create volumes of text, and they bring that anxiety of that volume of text with them into the classroom. And so I think it's really important not only to engage with students in the forum, but I do a lot of extra posting showing them how other people are thinking about ideas that tangentially relate to that discussion. I don't tell them you have to write this way. I just say, hey, I saw this person talk about this. What do you think as we discuss this? And so I introduce them scholars to them that way. I introduce research to them that way, but I don't frame it as, I want you to know this researcher. I want you to know this scholar. But by doing that, they begin to see that They're a part of a discourse community. And then when I give them feedback on the forum, I point out to them those things. You were fantastic here. You actually engaged the writing in this way. And I loved that. So I do not grade for clarity, for conciseness. If someone has thrown up plagiarism, you better believe it's coming down and it's getting a 0. But I really create forums around the opportunity of the process of thinking out loud. And when forums become thinking out loud, student writing becomes really so much more fluent by the end of that course. So I hope that answered your question.
It did. Thank you so much.
Perfect. If there are any other questions, we have a few more minutes if you guys want to pop those in the Q&A. Otherwise, thank you so much, Kay and Kathryn, for all of the valuable information you've shared with us today. The next concurrent session will begin at 1 p.m. Eastern. You can view the chat for session meeting room links or access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and their descriptions. While accessing the conference website, don't forget to swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hello to the Hawks team. While you're there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, request your free t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. Click on those coins to be entered into an additional raffle, and we will see you at the next session.
Thank you so much, Brianna and Jennifer, and Kathryn. And I'll see you in the next session.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.